We welcome you to this BYU Library Family History Virtual Sunday class. In our second class today, Elder James Tanner will be teaching Genealogical DNA for the Absolute Beginner. We thank James for taking the time to prepare and present this class, and will now turn the time over to him.
I'd also mention that all these videos are recorded and are put up on our BYU Family History Library YouTube channel on youtube.com. And we have 870 plus videos and usually about 5 new ones a week. So we are working ahead, answering questions and helping. One of the topics I think that's it's no longer a new topic. It's now an older topic from the genealogical community standpoint, but is understanding genealogical DNA for, and I'm using the term absolute beginner. When I say this, one of the things that is going to happen here is that my presentation will not get into all of the jargon. In other words, I'm not going to start explaining things like centimorgans and things like that. This is for people who conceptually don't understand DNA and also need some help understanding how it can benefit them. And so what I'm trying to do here is give an explanation of why you would want to get interested and learn more about DNA, as well as some of the things that you need to know that are kind of prerequisites to even having any kind of benefit from having a DNA test. And to start out, I'm going to acknowledge something. Genealogy and DNA are both challenging subjects. They're challenging in the sense of many kinds of complexities of number, complexities of concepts, complexities of just about anything any measure of complexity that you can. And when you start putting those together, then it increases the challenge considerably. In other words, there's a whole nother level of information that you need to know in order to benefit from having DNA testing. So when you get down to it, the value of a DNA test depends entirely on what you want to know. I mean, what is it that you're trying to understand or know will determine whether it has any value to you. And to give some ideas about this, in the first case, for example, if you're interested in genealogy, and I guess the question should be put into a question, are you interested in doing genealogical research and finding ancestors through examining old historical records? Or are you basically just kind of wondering where your family came from in sort of a vague way? Well, what we have out of the genealogy DNA providers is what's called ethnicity estimates. And what ethnicity estimates do is they tell you in a vague way about where your ancestors came from. And they do that because they have huge databases of DNA tests, and they can look at those and see where the people are matching and the degree of that DNA matching, and then tell you that you probably came from this area. Now, this is an ethnicity estimate, one of the ones for recently for me, and it raises some pretty interesting questions because I have been doing research for a very long time, now about 41 years going on, and I really have never found a relative from Italy, and I have basically never found a relative from Eastern Europe over there in Turkey and the sort of that area, the Middle East. But there are ways that I now know and understand how this could have happened and where these connections probably came from. But it comes from a lot of years of research, and I'll probably say that a number of times. Now, if you already have an extensive family tree, when I say extensive, I mean back 6, 7, or more generations, then I think the basic thing that a DNA test does is it validates your relationships. Okay. So why is this a validation of your relationships, and why is this important? Well, one of the category of stories that now come out from the increased use of DNA testing in conjunction with genealogical research is that people are finding that their parents that they've known all their lives are not their biological parents, that they are not related to their parents. And this can be quite disturbing. It can kind of make a lot of difference, or it might be revelatory, or it might be exciting, or it might, depending on the individual and the various relationships. Probably one of the classic issues that came up from this kind of discovery is that some considerable time ago, when someone came to me and sat down and said, now what do I do? Because I've been doing genealogical research on my family for 30 years, and now I found out that they're not my biological family. So what do I do at this point? Well, the only answer is, well, you have an option. You can continue to do research on your adopted family, or you can do more research and go back and start doing research on your biological family. So either way, it's not a negative issue from a genealogical standpoint. It's merely a situation where you've done a lot of research. And as far as your adopted family is concerned, if you consider that to be your adopted family, then basically you are certainly justified in keeping the issue away from your biological family. But the information is a deal changer. In other words, it not only validates relationships, it discovers relationships. So where do you get started? Well, there's two things. One is, even if you have just a passive interest, like you want to know where your family came from generally and whatever, and I'll be saying this more than once during this presentation, is you may be, at least from the very beginning of that thought, aware of the fact that you may find out information that you may not be happy with. And I keep using the word may because that is, it's really up to the individual, and their reaction to finding out their ancestry may contain people that they aren't happy about. And that is a very personal thing. In my case, even though there are some, I would call them surprises because of the area, it turns out that for me personally, that doesn't matter. But for some people, it could be disruptive and it could be life-changing. So learning about it, taking the test is obviously the first step. You've got to go ahead and get the test results. Now, that in itself, you can find out, is not going to help you a whole lot. And this is the reality of it. So if you're going to take a DNA test for genealogical reasons, and we're not taking a DNA test for medical reasons or for paternity or for any of the other possible reasons that we would be interested in genealogy, the question here is whether or not you're actually interested in genealogy. You're actually interested in going further than just taking a DNA test, but becoming involved directly with the genealogical research. So the only way you get the most benefit from a genealogical DNA test is in three parts. And the first part is simple, and that is you need to take the test. And the second part is you need to do that with a DNA testing company that has a large number of genealogical records, a big database, and of users, of people who are on that, using that particular program. And then you need to have your own family tree, and it has to be on the same program where you take your database, except in circumstances where you can transfer the data from a test with one program over to a test in another program. So when you go take a DNA test, if you were wanting to, say, use the test for Ancestry, MyHeritage, or whatever, then you should ask and find out whether or not this particular test unless it came directly from that company in the first instance, was going to have the ability to change and exchange that data with that company. Okay, so those are the kinds of considerations that you have to have. But the fundamental issue here is that without your own family tree, without developing that, and what I see very, very commonly is that people will do, who will have DNA tests on the larger programs, and they have no family tree. They have one or two people, or they have nothing. Well, they're going to get names and matches with their DNA test, and they're not going to have a clue who those people are because they don't have anything in their family tree. And so basically, from a genealogical standpoint, without a family tree, I mean a viable, developed research family tree, the DNA test has extremely limited value. Just summarizing, taking a DNA test without building your own family tree is really at the level of entertainment. It has some curiosity value, but it has no real value in identifying who these people were, exactly where they lived, or what the time periods were, or anything about that. That only comes from doing the actual genealogical, what do you call, paper genealogy. In other words, determining exactly who you're related to from records. And as I mentioned a moment ago, if you have that, if you have a big, let's call it a robust pedigree family tree, basically it helps you validate that, because your relatives that you've identified over the time that you've been working on your family tree start showing up as DNA matches. And if you're methodical about that, you can go down every line and see whether or not there's any matching from all the different people that you've already determined, or at least had records that said that you were related to. Now, what happens if you're not? Well, the reality of it is, and one example is adoptions here in the United States. If you have an adoption in the United States, almost uniformly since the mid-1800s, the movement has been to make adoptions very, very private and undiscoverable or very difficult to discover through the court actions, through the adoption process. And it was a very complex and very difficult thing to determine, first of all, that a person was adopted, and that may just come about by chance. And secondly, to identify the birth parents. And it could be expensive, and it could take a great deal of time, and it may even take a court order to get that to happen. Well, today you can take a DNA test, and it will indicate rather immediately, if some of the members of your immediate family and others take the test, that you are not related to your parents. And it may very well, depending on the circumstances of the company that supplies the DNA test, that you will be able to identify your biological parents with in some cases, very specific accuracy. That's kind of what happens here. And when we're moving along, what I'm basically saying is that without genealogy in a family tree program and what I would call some rather extensive research, then you'll be lost in a genealogical wilderness. You have now a lot of people who will show up as your matches to your genealogical data, but you won't even know who they are or where they are or how you're related to those people, because you haven't done any of the connection process, which is the genealogical research. So let's move on. What happens here now? Let's suppose that you're in the situation like I am, with having done a lot of research and having used the term, again, robust family trees going back generations. So what's going to happen? You're going to get DNA matches. Now, you may not get as many as I've gotten, but you can see from here that I have a lot. And I have 38,000 plus on Ancestry, and I have 15,000 plus on MyHeritage. And you can see down below, the number is a little bit larger than the number that was on when I originally drafted this a couple of weeks ago. And so even in the last couple of weeks, it's gone from 38,179 on MyHeritage up to, basically it went from 15,748 on MyHeritage up to that number, which was lower a while ago. So you can see that, it's just a lot of information. And when you're moving into that, it can be overwhelming. And that's one of the major reasons, if you really want to get a handle on your DNA matches. And you may not even get a small percentage of this number of DNA matches, because I'll explain why in a few minutes here. But basically, that's why you need to have started in working on a family tree and getting all that information. It basically understood your relationships and who these people are on the records before you get involved with the DNA test. Because when you get a DNA test, then you really have nothing to go on until you've reached a certain point where you may have questions that are going to be answered by that DNA test. So with both the DNA test and an active researched family tree, you really will be able to solve some types of family mysteries. The types of things that you can research are making a choice between different people who come up in the record. So let's suppose you do some research back and you find that you've got a William Smith back there, and there are 2 or 3 or 4 William Smiths. And then by using DNA, if you've done the research and you've done deep descendancy research and also connected with people, you can find people who are descendants from those remote ancestors, and then using DNA determine which one of the ancestors are William Smiths that you're related to. So there's some procedures. And when I said at the beginning that this was complex, it is, and it takes quite a bit of understanding, and it is an issue of structuring the DNA tests so that they are validated by the paper research when you get through with the DNA test results. That means that when you've done the research and you say, well, I think it's this person, this William Smith is my ancestor, then the work that you've done with the DNA and contacting people and getting and trying to validate that information is what determines whether or not you're correct. There's substantiation for what you have determined to be the case from your regular research, the research into historical records. And so this is, it is part of the process. DNA becomes a very valuable tool in answering questions which were otherwise not capable of being resolved by historical research into historical records, and traditionally that research. So I gave a short example, and I'm not going to repeat it, but before the class started, I mentioned finding a great-great-grandfather and determining whether or not he was adopted. Doing things like that before DNA testing were just simply not possible. There was no way to make that determination. So one of the things I mentioned a moment ago is you may also find unknown relatives. In other words, you may all of a sudden find out that you have a number of relatives living in a country that you had no idea that any of your family came from that area. And in some cases, depending on your own family's traditions and your beliefs and your, I could call them prejudices, you may have to readjust some of that, because DNA has a tendency to, let's call it, equalize everybody in the same, puts them on the same playing field. But important to understand at this point that DNA is a genealogical DNA, and we're talking about that different from forensic DNA, where they solve the mysteries and the crimes, and health DNA, where they're trying to determine what kind of a condition, medical condition you have. And genealogical DNA is interested in historical records and how people are related, not just through historical records, but through their actual DNA matching, which makes DNA moves genealogy not completely out of its historical context, but manages to, as I've used the term previously, validate that historical context, make it so that what you discover historically takes on some real meaning onto to who you are related to, in a sense. But again, it only works if you do the research. It does not work. It doesn't accomplish anything for you. You don't know anything more really than when you started if you don't have a substantial amount of research about your family and about what goes on in your family. And it's unfortunate that there are a fairly substantial number of people who have taken DNA tests, who I would even think the majority of the people who do not have family trees. And so there is just really no way we can even determine. I can say that I'm related to the person, but determining how we're related is not necessarily possible. So kind of emphasizing this, DNA tests do not come with the names of your relatives. You don't just get a DNA test and get a list of who your relatives are. It isn't going to provide you with a family tree. It will provide you with a pool of people who are related to you. It's up to you and your other relatives, I suppose, to put that into some kind of an organization, a pedigree, a family tree, that will show you what kinds of relationships that actually exist. So let's kind of look at the reality of taking a test. There are a number of companies, quite a few more than are on this slide, that offer DNA tests. From a realistic standpoint today in the genealogical community, from a genealogical standpoint, there are only two DNA testing companies that are more likely to help you than any of the others, and that's Ancestry DNA and MyHeritage DNA. And there are some others, 23andMe, Family Tree DNA, and Living DNA, and some others, quite a list of them. And in addition to that, there are, as I mentioned also, that it's important that if you, for example, take a 23andMe test for some reason, and you want to use that in a family tree, you have a limited database with 23andMe, and you have billions and billions of records in Ancestry and MyHeritage. Both have billions and billions of records and huge, huge user databases. So that's why the numbers, when I showed a slide just previously that showed thousands, tens of thousands of matches, that's somewhat overwhelming, because there's probably no way in my lifetime, given my age, that I'm going to be able to categorize or use much of that data in my research. And to a large extent, and you need to do some research here, is you need to choose the test depending on where your ancestors came from. What kinds of records do the two programs have? Ancestry's records as opposed to MyHeritage records. Now that changes almost daily. So it's not a static question. You know, this one always wins, this one always loses, or whatever, back and forth, because you never know which set of records they may have acquired in the last period of time. Ancestry announced at RootsTech conference earlier this year that they were going to be adding as many as 50 billion new records this year. Now, that's an awful lot. That may come close to doubling their current database of records. So what's happening with MyHeritage? MyHeritage adds, on my experience, somewhere around 1 billion new records about every month or so. And so this field is changing all the time, but they actually do not overlap and they're not the same records. When we're talking about choosing a DNA test, you need to investigate the programs and find out, look in their set of records and find out if they have records from the places that you suspect that your family came from. So, for example, if your family came from Scandinavia, you want a company that has Scandinavian records and Scandinavian users. If your family came from Latin America, South America, Central America, then you want a company that has records from Latin America and so forth. So it's a way of looking at it. Now, one of the issues that's pretty obvious at this point is that neither of these companies have a total coverage of the entire world in the number of records that they have and the number of users they have. So we're far from the point where, if your family came from a country in Indonesia, for example, or in the South, in the Pacific Islands, probably not that many DNA tests and probably not that many records are available. So determining that also determines which test you want to take. And then you may want to cover your bases. And I would suggest this. I would suggest taking more than one DNA test. Does that mean I suggest having your family tree on more than one program? Yes, I would. If you build an ancestry family tree, you can always export that ancestry family tree as a GEDCOM file, which is the Data Communications Transfer Program, and then upload that into MyHeritage and vice versa. You can do both. You can download it from MyHeritage and upload it to Ancestry. Question, can you upload or download your information or upload your information to Family Search? The answer is not now. And it would depend on what happens in the future, if that happens or not. So you may need to get involved in these companies with family trees in order to benefit fully from a DNA test from either one. Maybe getting your DNA test from Ancestry answers all your questions and you don't care. But my suggestion is that you may have more questions when you get 2 DNA tests or more. And this is the fundamental issue. Your DNA test results have to be compared to other people to find the connections. There's nothing that just magically says how you're related and gives you a family tree. It just doesn't work that way. So what you're happening here is that you're taking a test that gives you a substantial amount of information about you, about your makeup, what's in your physical body DNA that's in your cells in your body. And then we're matching that information out to other people. And when you do that, the percentage of the matches indicates the proximity of the relationship. So you get a higher percentage with someone who is a close relative, like a brother or sister, a sibling, than you would get if it was your 5th great grandfather and his descendants 15 generations removed. You may not get enough DNA out of that to even determine an accurate relationship. So there's a tremendous amount of information out there, but it may be compartmentalized and may be only able to be used in the situation when you have enough people that are out there. So the number of matches you get depends on the number of people, of your relatives, who take the same DNA test you do. In other words, if you come from a place where no one has taken a DNA test, you may not have any matches. Well, you may get some very distant matches of people from other places, because people do travel and they do intermix. And the interesting thing I find out on mine is when they give me a list of all the countries that my DNA matches come from, it's from all over the world. It's from places that I can't even imagine how my relatives got to those countries, because I had no idea that I had any relatives in places in those parts of the world. It's not really surprising to me because I know of everyone basically is related. And so there's going to be people related to me who are in other parts of the world. But on the other hand, you're not getting a whole lot of information from that, even though you find that person. They may not have a tree. They may not have a tree. You both may not have a tree that goes back into the people where the relationship, the DNA relationship, originates. So what can you learn from a genealogical DNA test with research in a family tree? What are the things that it actually does? What are the points that you're going to come up with? First of all, you get an ethnicity estimate about the origin of your family. Now, one thing about ethnicity estimates is they're going to change, because as the DNA testing companies get larger numbers of users, larger databases, larger matching pools for matching, you're going to get more accurate ethnicity estimates. The ethnicity estimates that we get today from MyHeritage and from Ancestry are quite a bit, I would say, significantly more specific than they were when they began. And so that helps you to understand where your family came from. Now, even at this level, it may raise some very serious questions with the areas where your family came from. You may not understand or ever had any idea that your family came from certain parts of the world. And that can be anything from making you very interested to making you very upset. And understanding the identity of the people who are genealogically related. So if you have a family tree, you can actually identify people that you never met or didn't have any idea or any contact with. And we're talking about living people, live relatives. So this has become, in a lot of cases, when I've talked to people and suggested that they get a DNA test, or even that they get on to Ancestry or MyHeritage or one of the other large programs, that finding out they have all these relatives is very, very important to them. It becomes emotionally a tremendous effect on the individuals. I've had people, when they saw how many relatives they had on one of the programs, for instance, on MyHeritage, break out into sobbing tears because they were so amazed that they had relatives. So this is kind of the background. And if you're talking to people in the technical, very technical sense about genealogy and DNA, and you're listening to the DNA people who are experts in the DNA testing process and the genealogical DNA field, they will basically get into very long and complex discussions on a lot of occasions on how you confirm the genealogical relationships and what the process is. And that's when I introduce this with the fact that both DNA and genealogy can be complex subjects. And in some cases, the descriptions of the process for establishing a DNA relationship can be extensively long if you read some of the accounts. And here's kind of the one that gets the news, and that is that it identifies adoptees or foundlings, people who did not know their biological parents or their biological relatives, and they're able to find and connect with their family. And this can be, once again, it can be disturbing, or it can be very, very fulfilling, and it can be an amazing experience. Once again, this is kind of the caution. This is where you've got to sort of be a little bit aware and be kind of more than comfortable with the whole process here. And that is, you may be surprised. So make sure you're prepared for the results. Just be aware that this may be a life-changing experience. It may be something that you just look at it and go, oh, yeah, well, I didn't know that. And then it may also be something that really kind of turns your world upside down. So when you talk about DNA tests, there's really a number of different types, and they're mainly three types. And this is the ones that you start hearing about. And rather than getting into long jargon discussions about how all of these work and what they do, they're basically called the Y-DNA or Y chromosome test, and looks for direct paternal line. In other words, if you're going to try to establish that a grandfather back a number of generations is your grandfather and the records are not clear, the idea here is to get a few people, it doesn't make too many, who are also assuming they are direct descendants from that particular ancestor. And then you get to get the Y-DNA test. But this goes from father to father to father to father. And in my case, for example, in any of the cases that I go, any of the tests that I go through, because the way my father came from his ancestors and the way my mother came from her ancestors, I don't have a clear line going back on any of my lines except my paternal surname line. So the only line that I'm able to have that it would be even productive at doing a DNA test would be if I was trying to confirm someone on my paternal line. The Tanners back, Tanner, back. And the answer to that is it's like 14 generations back. It's possible, but finding people who are in my situation who have a direct father relationship going back are going to be finding some Tanners that go back that way. And so if we ever decided to do that test back that far, it would take some finding of individuals who qualified and then convincing them to get involved to the level of wanting to take a test. But even then it wouldn't matter because we cannot identify in the records the person from among a pool of people. And all we would probably confirm is that we were all related to someone who had that same name, who we had designated the remote ancestor, period. In other words, we don't learn who the person was. We can only confirm it if we have records that show that we suspect that the person is, and that we validly trace our records back to that person. If everyone could do that, then we could say, yes, that's our ancestor, but that still might not identify which of all the people with the same name that ancestor was. So there's a kind of catches in these things, and there are some ways of doing it, and there's some complex procedures that have been developed that will allow that to happen. The one that's most common is the mitochondrial or mtDNA testing, and that looks at the direct maternal line, and that is also the same restrictions. You've got to fit mother back. And then the one that's the most common given test is the one that is what you would go get automatically if you go to one of the large testing companies like Ancestry or MyHeritage, is the autosomal DNA test. And that's just a snapshot of ethnicity and living relatives based on the family tree and the information that you have already discovered. But it is only accurate to the extent that the percentages get so small that after about 6 or 7, maybe at most 8 generations back, and it doesn't really establish much of an actual relationship. It shows general relationship as a person, as an individual human, but it doesn't necessarily help produce information that can tell you how or when or how you were related to that person. To a great extent, the number of matches also depends on the total number of people that you have in your family tree and where those people came from. Okay, why that? Well, the more people that you have in your family tree, there's more options to have that their descendants would have taken a DNA test. Okay, so that gives you some sort of idea. I mean, if your line has you have very few cousins, and you don't even know some of your more remote relatives, you may not end up getting very many DNA results. If you have something like in my situation, where you have tens of thousands of cousins that you know are related to you, then the confirmation is only that you get more DNA matches. So you get all these extra people in there that are all matching. So, for example, and this is going back a little bit on sort of looking at the information and some of the things I've already talked about, but one of my family lines ended up in Australia. So, or two of my family lines ended up in Australia. And so the question is, do I have any DNA matches with people in Australia? And the answer is yes, I do. So basically, we have a validation of the fact that these people lived in Australia and that their descendants are still there. This is kind of, what you've got, because with the numbers like this, you really, it's just a lot of people out there. It's just more than you can, that you can handle in some cases. Yeah, and here's the one I was thinking about a moment ago when I showed the slide. When I did this first slide, there were 15,576 DNA matches. And when I did this slide yesterday, or updated the slide, there were 15,748. So I've picked up another couple of hundred DNA matches over the last a few weeks. So that's going to increase as the number of people increases in my family tree increase, as well as the number of people that are taking DNA tests increase. And I mentioned this, and this is a kind of a graphic that'll show you what I meant by the fact that I said ethnicity estimates change as the companies acquire additional information. So on the left there in 2017, you'll see what was my ethnicity estimate from MyHeritage 2017. As time passes, then this is the more revised version of the DNA test ethnicity estimate in 2023. And it shows you that there are a significant number of people from the British Isles and from the Scandinavian countries, and particularly with Denmark, and which is correct. And then there are a few others. Now, how did this all happen? And where did it come in my ancestry? Well, it was a mystery for a while, because even at the test 2017, it was showing a lot of people from Eastern Europe, and then a lot of significant percentages from the Indian subcontinent and the area of India. And so how did that happen? After 41 years of doing research, I didn't have any people from all those places I didn't even know about. Well, the people from Central Europe, the people who showed that they came from North Central Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, and north of the Ukraine, Belarus, and the countries over there, the historic countries, obviously, not the current named countries. But those people actually come to me from rather recently acquired genealogy through my great-great-grandfather, who was Jewish and whose family came from the Netherlands and ultimately came from that Eastern European gene pool. So that one gets explained. So the question is, what about the Italians? Well, in Italy, it shouldn't be surprised to anyone who has Great Britain, any ancestry in Great Britain, because the Roman Empire was in Great Britain for almost 500 years. So, there was a lot of time for intermarriages and people that could have picked up Italian genes. What about the Middle East? Well, that's still a little bit of a mystery. But what's happening now is that we have the research that we've done, and this is over a period of many, many years, has indicated that at least one of my lines, and maybe more, could have been Romany. That means they were gypsies. And that's the area where they came from ultimately. So this is not surprising any longer. And it actually is fairly accurate with respect to all of the research that we've done in our family over the last years. Now, as far as the United States, that's not surprising at all. I mean, we get people all over the United States, particularly in the western part of the United States. So even though they can cause consultant, and I've mentioned that they might cause some concern, because here's the entire list. These are all the places where people show up having DNA that matches my DNA. And what is if you're going to look at this sort of objectively, you're going to have to acknowledge that no matter who you think you are really related to practically everybody in the world. And this actually takes it back in a scientific standpoint, and it's what's called the genetic isopoint. It's or also called the identical ancestors point, or the IAP. And that's where the family trees of any two people on the earth, that means anybody from any place on the face of the earth that now, and no matter how distantly related they are, it can be traced back to the same set of individuals. And that is the basis for this whole DNA thing, because what DNA is unalterably determining is that we are all very, very closely related when it comes to DNA. So there is no such thing as race. There's no such thing as, the only other is everything else is superficial compared to the fact that we all share the same gene pool. So you may want to learn more. And how do we go about doing that? Well, first of all, I would suggest the Family History Guide, which has now been associated as an integrated part of it has been integrated into the FamilySearch.org website as part of the Learning Center. And there's a pretty substantial DNA testing educational background here to DNA that will give you some very good basics and quite a few links to information. The other standard basic, as complete as you can possibly imagine, is ISOG, the International Society of Genetic Genealogy Wiki, which has an almost inexhaustible amount of information into whatever amount of detail that you can possibly imagine. And some of the articles are fundamental, and some of them get into very, very complex explanations. Very useful. So part of this is part of continuing searching for your family origins. And if you make that effort to search, then you're starting off on quite an interesting adventure. And it may lead out to areas that you never knew existed. Okay, well, thanks for watching.